Part. I'm here in Kansas City. I'm on the Show Me Cannabis Board of Directors, and I guess I just wanted to welcome you all and introduce Mr. Dan Beets. He is the chair of our Board of Directors. He's going to talk for just a second about what we do, and then we're going to start with Mr. Neill Franklin, the Executive Director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, talking about their efforts to create a more safe and just drug policy. So, without ado, Mr. Dan Beets.
Thank you. Well, as I found myself saying a lot of times lately, this is the most exciting time to be involved with marijuana law reform since Prohibition began. I mean, that's not news to you all, but it is an exciting time to be working on this issue. I've been involved in a variety of ways for 40 years. I can't believe that. But at any rate, you know, things have been building for a long, long time, and now we're seeing the fruits of our labors. And the activity in the Missouri General Assembly, in the Missouri Legislature last year, was far greater than it's ever been before. And what was impressive to me was that the legislators take us seriously. They take us very seriously now, and they didn't used to do that. If we got a hearing on a bill in the past, it was just an excuse for silly jokes and puns, and we were clearly being dismissed. This year, that was not the case. We will see at least 3 or 4 or more marijuana law reform bills filed in the Missouri General Assembly this coming year, and those bills, again, will be taken more seriously than they ever have before. I'm very honored to share Show Me Cannabis Board of Directors. I've worked with NORML for about 40 years, and NORML and Show Me Cannabis are partners in sponsoring this conference and partners in working toward marijuana law reform throughout the state of Missouri. We are very happy that you all are here, especially that you're here this early in the day. That's very impressive. As I say, NORML's been around for some 40 years. Show Me Cannabis cropped up just a couple of years ago, and what caused that to happen is primarily one very generous donor who wanted to see a new organization created that focused specifically on initiative efforts, and that's what Show Me Cannabis' primary purpose is. And it's likely that the legislature is not going to do everything we want them to do. We intend to place the question of taxing and regulating cannabis like alcohol on the ballot before the Missouri voters in either 2014 or 2016, and we'll talk more about that later today. But what has allowed this movement to ramp up in Missouri a lot more in the past couple of years is the fact that Show Me Cannabis has the resources to actually pay at least one full-time person to work on this issue. And we're very fortunate to have as our executive director, Mr. John Payne. John is an extraordinarily talented, intelligent, articulate, and dedicated spokesman for our issue. Please welcome Mr. John Payne.
Thank you, Dan. You know, we should all be very appreciative of everything that Dan has done over the years. He's been involved in this pretty much longer than longer than I've been alive, and so that's pretty impressive. And you know, one of the things I have been involved in this movement for a fairly long time for some of my age. I'm 30 years old, and I wrote my first speech on this topic when I was still in junior high. It did not go over well in Southeast Missouri. But then, you know, I went off to college. I was deeply involved with Washington University Students for Sensible Drug Policy, which is another great organization. And when we were probably 2003 or 2004, we had a guy come speak by the name of Jack Cole. And Jack founded a group called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And I went and saw him speak, and you know, there was this cop that was talking about his years working with the New Jersey enforcing drug laws and saying how they just didn't work and it was a waste of his time. And I cannot say enough great things about the work that Law Enforcement Against Prohibition does, because it gives a new credibility to a lot of the arguments that have been advanced by people in this room for a long time. And you know, part of the thing is that the messenger matters almost as much as the message itself. And so when you have people in law enforcement coming out and saying, like, look, I've been there, I've worked on this, and these policies are counterproductive. They're making our streets more dangerous, and they're not actually stopping any addiction. And so that's one reason why we work a lot with law enforcement that favors reform. Here in Missouri, you know, we employ Gary Wiegert, who is a St. Louis police sergeant, and he also lobbies for us part-time. He actually had to fight his department and sue them in federal court to be allowed to do that, but he does continue to work with us. And then, whenever we have a conference like this, we like to try to bring in a national spokesman from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And we are very fortunate to have with us today the Executive Director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, Mr. Neill Franklin. And Neill worked in Maryland for 33 years in law enforcement. He spent 23 of those years with the state patrol, and he actually was, for a while, the director of narcotics training for the state patrol in Maryland. But he had a sort of revelation about what is wrong with the drug war while working in that job, and he will tell you more about that. So please welcome Neill Franklin.
Well, good morning, and thanks for having me. I want to again thank John and Dan and Amber for putting together just a great program, running a great organization in Show Me Cannabis. Missouri, who would have thought, right? But because of the work of your leaders here, this is where we are, and you're moving right along. Really moving right along. And I just want to also thank John again for his wonderful colors that he's wearing of purple. I'm from Baltimore, home of the Ravens, world champions. Now I know where the Chiefs are this year, and it's a very good place, undefeated. So I applaud you for that. So maybe this is your year coming up. So I'm happy we got ours in. So just wanted to throw that out there. So yeah, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition and Internet. Who's heard of us, by the way, before today? Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. That's good. So we're getting better at getting the word out. We're doing better at getting the word out. International nonprofit organization of law enforcement professionals, cops, judges, criminal prosecutors, corrections officials, prison wardens. And as John said, founded in 2002 by a gentleman by the name of Jack Cole and Peter Criss. Retired law enforcement who, like I, has spent many of those years on the front lines of the war on drugs. And we've come to see two parallels. We've come to see that we have been here once before with alcohol prohibition back in the 1920s. Any of you remember that? No. Not firsthand? Okay, just what you learned in school, right? It didn't work. It didn't work. So after only 13 years, my grandparents and your grandparents decided that they needed to end it. We had very violent communities and neighborhoods because of the policy of prohibition, not that people drank alcohol. Don't get me wrong, people do stupid things when they're drunk. But we had two issues. We had one of drug use and sometimes abuse. Notice I said sometimes abuse, because overall, by far, all the drugs we're talking about, use is not a problem. But there are those times when we have abuse, and that's when it becomes a problem. So we have the issue of drug use, but on the other side, we created another one called drug prohibition, which created an underground, criminal, illicit trade for alcohol back then, and today, drugs. And all drugs used to be legal at one time. Okay, you go back to 1901, you could buy heroin, an ounce, in your local drugstore for $4.85. All drugs used to be legal. But for a number of various reasons, over time, 1914 Harrison Act and some other policies, Harry Anslinger, one of the main architects in moving drugs into a state of prohibition. As we come through the years, more and more drugs became illegal. Reefer Madness. You guys ever seen that movie, right? Propaganda film about reefer and the fear factor. The fear factor is very powerful in getting people to support something. Okay, and sometimes we do it blindly. And then we end up in the 1970s with Richard Nixon. Okay, public enemy number one, dangerous drugs. Drugs are neither good or bad, folks. They just are. It's all about the environment. The environment that we create for their existence, for their use. And if that's a bad environment, you know what? Using those drugs within that bad environment, we're going to have bad experiences. The environment of prohibition is one of the worst that we could have set up. And that's what we did. And now we're seeing that after 40 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So law enforcement against prohibition, now that we've spent so much time fighting these policies of prohibition, we've come to realize that not only are these policies ineffective, first of all, they were dead on arrival. You know, putting them in place to reduce crime, disease, death, and addiction never ever worked. Never will work. Something else we found out is that they were actually counterproductive to public safety. And that's why we do this work, to improve public safety. But here we were enforcing policies that were actually making our jobs more difficult. Okay? Making it easy for gangs and organized crime to set up shop and make today globally $322 billion. Tax-free. And what happens when they have disagreements among themselves? Okay? Do they do like Coors and Anheuser-Busch and go to court with their attorneys and briefcases? No. They pick up a gun and they fight each other in the streets for the available territory. What else happens when we, law enforcement, see this happening and we're going to go in and we're going to take down these organizations, we're going to push hard, we're going to lock up this crew that's terrorizing this neighborhood. We go in and surgically remove them, what happens? Backfill, right? Okay, so there are 3 or 4 crews in the surrounding area. They're going to come in and they're going to fight for that vacant real estate, job opportunity, right? They're going to fight for that. Again, they're not going to do it in our courtrooms, folks. They're going to do it on your street corners with guns and fear, witness intimidation, and everything that comes from that. And they just don't fight. We just don't have the shootouts during that time as they're backfilling that vacant real estate. You see, because during that time, people get shot, drug dealers die, and even though that dust may settle once the new crew takes over, now the other crews have to come and retaliate because they had members who were killed or shot. And it continues. Then we, law enforcement, come back again, do a 6-month, 9-month investigation, do it all over again. Have the table loaded with drugs, money, and guns, you know, the TV cameras and everything, and look what we've done. There was some small town, Siena or something like that, locally here in Missouri, that just made 20-something arrests, breaking down another cocaine organization. And chief of police is on TV and says, huh, gee, it could happen anywhere. You're daggone right it can happen anywhere. It's just not isolated to our big cities like Baltimore, where I'm from. The HBO series, The Home of the Wire, anybody ever seen that? It's a real-life depiction of what goes on in Baltimore. Very, very true to life. I'm here to tell you. So, I told you a little bit about the organization and why we do what we do. You know, all of us who make up our organization come from different perspectives. You know, we didn't make that 180-degree turn all for the same reasons. Mine were for violence. You know, the killings. I had enough. But unfortunately, my 3 decades of law enforcement and working in the trenches of, you know, doing undercover work and managing drug task forces and watching the drug dealers kill each other, I was one of those jaded people. That's criminals killing criminals. What do I care, right? What do I care? But it wasn't until someone close to me ended up the same way. Murder. A young man by the name of Ed Totley, who in 2000, right after I retired from the Maryland State Police and was now working for the Baltimore Police as the commander of training, he was working undercover with the FBI in Washington, D.C. He was buying cocaine. He was good at what he did. He had worked undercover for about 14 years up until this point. And he was telling me about this case that he's working. He had worked many undercover cases for me, and now he's telling me about this one he's working with the FBI. He had been loaned out to them, and he was going to make the final buy of cocaine. They had his car wired with audio and video, preparing surveillance team, takedown team, and they were going to arrest this guy, and as we do, then try to work our way up to his supplier and so on and so on. Just an endless hamster wheel that we're on. So on October 30th, I get a phone call late at night. It was about 11 o'clock at night. And it was a mutual friend of Ed Totley and me. And he said he's got some bad news. And he said it's about Ed. And I knew what it was right away. Because Ed and I had been talking about this case, and I knew he was going to be doing this deal. So he said Ed had been shot. But we didn't know how bad. So I head down to the hospital with my wife, and it's about an hour's drive from where I was living. And believe me, folks, I was probably over 100 miles per hour the entire way. But it took forever to get there. It seemed like it. So when I get there and walk into the emergency room, there just a sea of police officers and family members, and you can hear them talking about, first of all, that Ed had already died, and then they're talking about how they're going to go back out and push harder and lock up anybody that has anything to do with illicit drugs. Whether you're selling, whether you're using, they don't care whether you're addicted, and as we all know, that's a health issue. Right? That's an illness. We don't care whether you just connected this person to that person. Conspiracy. If you have anything to do with it, we're going to lock you up. And we're going to press hard. Some of those folks are still doing that today, just as hard. But some of us started thinking about, for me as a commander, and running these type of operations, I'm thinking, all right, who in the hell screwed up? Who dropped the ball? Who didn't see what they should have seen? There was a surveillance team. Where were they? Because I didn't know the details of the case. I didn't know, exactly how it went down or anything at that time. But these are the questions that you normally ask. But as the days went on, and as the weeks went on, and the months went on, you just started thinking about other things. I started thinking about other police officers I knew who were killed in similar circumstances, all the way back to when I was working undercover. And just a short time after Ed was killed, I'm now working in the Baltimore Police Department. We had 2 police officers killed in our streets by drug dealers. Doing their work, interviewing drug dealers. Drug dealer gets spooked, pulls out a gun and shoots the police officer, kills him. And then I started to realize that, it's the system. It's the policies that we have in place. You see, because it wasn't any longer the cops. And what made me start thinking about innocent people getting killed was exactly 2 years to the month after Ed was killed, the Dawson family in Baltimore, a family of 7 was killed. The entire family by one drug dealer in one night. Because the mother, Angela, was working with the police, as we want citizens to do, to uproot drug dealers from the neighborhood. And she had one on the corner right in front of her house. And she didn't want her young boys being recruited into that deadly game. She knew that if they were, their life expectancies would diminish. She wasn't really concerned about them ever becoming addicted. Her number one concern was about being recruited into that business. So one night, this drug dealer decided, because he found out that she was working with the police, he decided he's going to send a message. And he does, in the form of fire. He breaks into their home and he sets it on fire as they slept. That's one hell of a way to die. The entire family wiped out. Then I started thinking about all the innocent people getting caught in drive-by shootings and running gun battles across this country. Day after day after day after day. You know, these drug gangs, as they go about their business in retaliation, are shooting the wrong people. You know, in Chicago, a young girl, teenage girl gets gunned down. You know, wrong place, wrong time. These drug gangs are looking for a particular individual, and they mistake that person, innocent young man, for somebody else, and they shoot him. Day after day, this is what's going on. Ask any police officer in any major city around this country why we have most of our homicides, and they'll tell you 60 to 70% of the homicides that we have in our cities are directly related to the drug trade. Definitely not people smoking marijuana. You know, but then you'll have people that say, well, you know, if we didn't have so many people using drugs and using marijuana, then we wouldn't have the illicit trade. Wake up, people. Wake up. We are a species that have been using drugs ever since we've been here on this planet. And if you think we can stop it, if you think we can have a drug-free America or a drug-free anything, wake up. You can't even have a drug-free prison. And they're supposed to be as secure as we can make anything, right? You can't keep drugs out of prison. You can't keep them out of your neighborhood or anyplace else. We have to figure out what is going to be the best policy, the safest policy, the most productive policy for managing drugs within our communities, because they were here since we've been here, they're here today, and they're going to be here tomorrow. They're coming up with drugs that mimic the drugs that we have deemed illegal. Spice, K2, mimicking the effects of marijuana. You know, these chemically based synthetic drugs. And you know what? We're scrambling to prohibit them, causing the same problems, an underground illicit trade. The chemists are one step ahead of the policymakers in changing the chemical composition, but you know what? There's hope, because in New Zealand, they recognize this. And they said, you know what? We're just going to create a process for those chemists who want to produce a new drug. We're going to make a process for them to make their drug as safely as possible, and then let people know exactly what the drug is and what it will do. We're not going to get on this hamster wheel like the United States. And that's what they've done. And they make those companies, those people who are creating these designer drugs, they pay for everything. They pay for the process, they pay for everything. It's not costing the taxpayers anything. And it's working. It's working. No criminal gangs selling it, no battles in the streets over it. They figured it out. That's what we need to do here. Missouri, marijuana, Washington State, Colorado, and where we're headed now, as people are starting to learn, people are becoming educated. You know, like Show Me Cannabis. 700,000 plus people every year being arrested for marijuana possession in this country. That's appalling. You will hear the opposition, those people who still want to maintain the status quo, saying things like, oh, we don't send people to prison for marijuana. Yes, we do. Even if it's just for a day. Okay, that's a day too long. Even if it's just in the back of a police car, you know what? That's too long and too much. Even if they're not convicted, their lives are ruined. If you spend a day in prison, in jail, in a local jail because you've been arrested and you're trying to make bail, you know what? That's a day you can't make it to your job. And that might be the day you get fired because they needed you there and they're going to fire you. Just the arrest alone without a conviction, I can find it. And if I can find it on this smartphone, so can a potential employer. I also have a private detective license that I don't practice anymore, but I used to do background investigations for employers. There was a time when I would go to the courthouse to pull records. And if someone's record had been expunged, I won't find anything. No PI does that anymore when they're doing these background investigations for employers. We just go to the computer and search all the databases out there. If we find an arrest, we report it back to the employer. The employer's got 10 applications, 2 people have arrests for marijuana charges, slide them aside. I only have time to focus on the 8. School loans, housing issues, the list is long. And come on, people, you know, especially for our young people, you know, we make unwise choices sometimes. Okay? We do. I did. When I was in high school, I smoked pot when I was in high school, and it's a good thing I didn't get caught. Because I wouldn't have had the career that I've had in law enforcement. What about our presidents? Some actually in hell. Some didn't. But what if they had been arrested? Maybe it would have been good for us if some of them were. So that's probably a bad example. But what I'm saying is, overall, it's time for a change. It's time for us to wake up. It's time for us to realize that these policies that we have put in place to manage drugs within our communities do not work. I could speak all day on this issue. I could talk about, you know, overdose deaths. You know, I could talk about needle exchange programs. I could talk about so many other things, because this policy of drug prohibition affects every single one of us in some size, shape, or form, and in a negative way. I can talk about the costs, financially and people. You know, that it's costing us over $50 billion every year in cops and courtrooms and prisons around this country. I could talk about mass incarceration. You know how when we began the drug war in 1970, we had less than 500,000 people in prison for all drug crimes. Somewhere around 415,000 people for all drug crimes. You know, those arrests. You know, just a couple of decades later, that number had soared to 1.9 million arrests around the country for all drug crimes. 1.9 million. And of that 1.9 million, 43% of that, almost half, was for marijuana. Marijuana. Of that 43%, 89% of that was for possession. All these people were arrested around this country. I can talk about the diversity issues. In this state of Missouri, if you happen to be black, your chances are 2.6 times higher of being arrested for marijuana possession than someone who's white. On a national scale, it's more than 3 times higher in being arrested for black people. In my hometown of Baltimore, that number's off the charts. Off the charts. In the state of Missouri, it's costing you over $49 million every year to do that in law enforcement. I can talk to you about the wasted resources of law enforcement. Here we are out chasing people who are smoking pot. A decision they should be able to make. They're not harming anyone. I thought this was the United States, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the land of the free. Guess I was wrong. We're wasting our law enforcement resources and chasing people who are smoking marijuana when we could be solving violent crimes. Before the drug war, before 1970, we solved 9 out of 10 murders in this country. That's pretty good. I would prefer 10 out of 10, but I'll take 9 out of 10. Today, it's 6 out of 10. We have technology. We have DNA testing. Those numbers should be improving, right? Same thing for rapes, arson, robbery. The same decline in numbers for those crimes as well. What about crimes against our children? Domestic violence. We're not spending the appropriate amount of time, even on the call. When we get the call to do the investigation, first of all, we get there half hour late, you know, we should be there right away. But because we're spending so much time in clearing drug corners and making these low-level drug arrests, we're not paying attention in those areas where we should be as law enforcement. That needs to change. And I'm going to tell you right now, the cops on the street would love to see that change. Would love to see that change. You know, and I could talk to you again about the prison industrial complex and how much money is being made from that. Private prisons should never be an option in this country. Never. But we have Corrections Corporation of America. You can invest on the New York Stock Exchange, going from state to state to state, making deals saying that we will manage your prisons for less money, but you have to keep them 80 to 90% full, the beds occupied. What does that mean when you really think about it? You know, when they go lobby at your state capitol and on Capitol Hill to keep this system in place, what does that really mean and boil down to? It boils down to us putting as many people in prison as we can as a society. And that's wrong. Absolutely wrong. Law enforcement continues, and I'm going to wrap it up with this. Law enforcement continues to be the main group in opposition to making this change. When I say law enforcement, it's mainly the hierarchy, those running the agencies, and the unions. You know, like the Narcotics Officers Association of California. You know, I'll call them out. The International Chiefs of Police Association. And I mentioned the International Chiefs of Police Association for a good reason. Who agrees for the most part that we should listen to our parents? I mean, I did. I'm glad I listened to my parents. They listen all the time, but most of the time it is. International Chiefs of Police Association. August Vollmer was the chief of Berkeley City Police Department in California back in the 1920s. He became the president for the Chiefs of Police Association for California before he eventually became the president for the International Chiefs of Police Association. So pretty much the father of the International Chiefs of Police. We went all the way back to the 1920s. You know, after we had began the 1914 Harrison Act to prohibit these drugs, right? So he makes a comment about prohibition and what we're doing. You know, we had already seen what had happened with alcohol prohibition. This is a very bright guy. Now this is what he says, head of the International Chiefs of Police Association. And this is his quote regarding drug prohibition. Stringent laws, vigorous prosecution, and imprisonment of addicts and peddlers have proved not only useless and enormously expensive as means of correcting this evil, but they are also unjustifiably and unbelievably cruel in their application to the unfortunate drug victims. Repression has driven this vice underground and produced the narcotic smugglers and supply agents who have grown wealthy out of this evil practice, and who, by devious methods, have stimulated traffic in drugs. Finally, and not the least of the evils associated with repression, the helpless addict has been forced to resort to crime in order to get money for the drug which is absolutely indispensable for his comfortable existence. That's exactly what law enforcement against prohibition is saying. I wish that the international chiefs of police would listen to their father and start making some wise decisions and supporting reform. Thank you.
We've got a few extra minutes, and that's your water, by the way, if you're thirsty.
Oh.
And so we thought, if you guys have questions, Neill's probably got lots of answers, so.
Two things. Rural areas and meth. My sister teaches in an area where basically there are two economies, Walmart and the meth economy. And the children born in that particular world are way behind me. Biologically, they have defects, learning defects as a result of these drugs. Would you put this in the same category as, say, marijuana, which is a benign sort of substance, as opposed to some of these chemicals produced that are really deadly?
Okay, so that's your question is about, for those who didn't hear, is about meth. And, you know, how, again, you know, the environment of the meth trade, and as someone said, the drug itself causes so many health issues for people, mainly our young people. And it being, you know, one of the, probably the two largest economies in many areas, especially around here. And I get that, I understand that. The first thing I want you to realize and understand that all of these harms and everything that we're seeing is under the current policies of prohibition.
Yes.
Okay? So I need people to realize that. The second thing I want to mention, there is a book that you definitely need to read. It is called High Price by Carl Hart, H-A-R-T. He is a Columbia University professor. He's not just a Columbia University professor. This professor grew up in these exact environments. So it's not someone who's done a study from the results of somebody else's study. This guy has lived it, and now he's done studies using people and drugs, like meth, and evaluating them, you know, some great work. Read that. And the reason I tell you to read his book, and let me just first say that Leap's position is the more problematic a drug can potentially be, the more of a reason for regulation and control. Okay, so, you know, with the meth trade, we see a couple of problems. Number one, you know, we're having these shake and bake labs and homes are blowing up, catching on fire every time you turn around. Because again, there's no regulation and control. There's no way for people to gain access to really what is just a very strong amphetamine. Okay? There's no way to get access to it except through the underground illicit trade. All right, so people want to cook this stuff, they're going to do it in dangerous situations, they're going to use some really bad chemicals to do it, whatever they can get their hands on to do it. Again, that environment becomes very dangerous and very problematic, producing a very substandard product. Okay, so now, if you read Carl Hart's book, he's going to tell you at the end of the day, what methamphetamine is really just that, amphetamines. Okay? We give amphetamines to a lot of people. What about our pilots who are flying these, you know, 12-hour long sorties in a billion-dollar airplane? They don't want to crash in a billion-dollar airplane. So they take it in pill form. Okay? At the end of the day, if we had a system of regulation and control, a marketplace for people to use, to buy, to access amphetamines at that level of strength, we would be in a better place. You're not going to end the illicit meth trade until you end the prohibition of meth and figure out what's going to be the best way for producing it, and then, you know, getting it to people who want it, who are going to access it anyway, I don't know exactly what that policy would look like, and it's going to depend upon the community to decide what that policy looks like. But the first thing to realize is that that drug would be 10 times more safe if it were in some sort of regulated and controlled market. Something else. When I was working undercover, we referred to meth as the poor man's cocaine. Meth came about because cocaine was illegal. Cocaine's a stimulant, a very powerful stimulant. Meth is a very powerful stimulant. Again, we're causing things to happen with these policies of prohibition. We're causing people to invent designer drugs or chemically based drugs that for a while will be legal because what they would probably like to use is illegal. And we're going to forever chase that rabbit down that hole, be on that hamster wheel until we decide we just need to end prohibition, period, and figure out the best way for managing drugs within our community. And like I said, that meth trade is also a very violent trade too. So again, we've got people competing with each other, using violence in controlling that marketplace. So, yeah, John.
Can you talk a little bit about sort of the perverse incentives that the federal government has put in place for police departments to focus on drugs as opposed to violent or property crimes?
Okay, so John's asking about the incentives from the federal government for our law enforcement, which helps to maintain this heavy focus on drug crimes instead of other crimes of violence. For instance, federal grants. We get millions and millions of dollars in law enforcement every year through federal grants like the Burn Grant and COPS Grant. And that's to focus on drug enforcement and gangs. And believe me, they're all one and the same. If we ended again prohibition, our gang problem would decrease dramatically because they wouldn't have the money to survive and to do the things that they do. So we get these federal dollars as incentives. When I was the Chief of Human Resources for the Baltimore Police Department, I also had finance. I had a special unit of about 4 or 5 people who their job was to find me federal money. However, in order to qualify for these grants, I had to show that I had a drug problem in Baltimore. How do we do that in law enforcement? Anybody? Arrest people, right. It doesn't matter what we arrest them for, whether they're a kingpin or whether they're someone who's selling to get money to buy drugs because they're addicted, or someone who's just possessing or conspiracy. It doesn't matter where they are in that food chain. It didn't matter. At the end of the day, a hash mark is a hash mark. Okay? And we wanted as many hash marks as we could to put in that report to justify the need for federal dollars. And we did a very good job at it. Numbers-driven policing. Numbers-driven policing, that's what we do. The other side of this money gravy train, as you will hear referred to, is asset forfeiture.
Yeah.
Okay? Wow. Couple quick examples here. And first of all, the drug task forces that I managed, we took a lot of money from people. We took a lot of cars from people. And many of those people that we did this to, we didn't even charge them for the crime. Yeah, really. And it's legal because it's a civil process. All we have to do, and so that we don't violate the Fifth Amendment, which, having due process before the government can take your property. Yeah, we'll give you due process. You come meet with us with your attorney. How much is that going to cost, Dan?
Hundreds, thousands.
Right. And usually more than what the property and money's worth, so we end up keeping it. But anyway, I was watching a video the other night of Sheriff's Department in South Georgia, right as you come across the Florida line, about how they sit at this particular location on Interstate 95, facing southbound traffic. You see, because money goes south, drugs go north. They're not concerned about the drugs going north, they're watching traffic coming south. And they are they're funding their fleet, buying cars, building substations, buying whatever they want by taking money from people who are traveling south on Interstate 95. Just here, saw something kind of, John, when we were coming across Interstate 70. John's driving, of course, I'm looking all over the place. I'm glad you were looking straight ahead, paying attention to driving. But I'm looking on the other side of Interstate 70 on the eastbound lanes, and I see a police car with a motorist stop. The interesting thing, it wasn't highway patrol. Out on the interstate. What was it, Wentzville? Wentzville Police Department. I'm like, why is he on the interstate? Should be out in the neighborhoods. Should be interacting with citizens in his community, in his town, and store owners, and maybe stopping to talk to kids or whatever. But why is he out on the interstate? We got the highway patrol for that, work on the interstate. It's about seizing money and property. And it happens all across this country. We are misguided as law enforcement. We are so hung up on these, by far, low-level drug crimes for possession that we are not doing what we're supposed to be doing in our communities, protecting people from violent people. There's your long answer to a short question. Yes, ma'am.
How can the local communities get current and former law enforcement involved in working towards change?
Yeah, great question, because we're always looking for referrals. Number one, for folks like you to introduce, police officers and judges and criminal prosecutors, either current or retired, that to introduce them to us, because as we continue to grow our organization, we are really changing the minds of people as we travel around the country and around the world. We have a speakers bureau, and this is what we do. We educate people from our perspective. We used to have a lot of people who would debate us years back. It's very difficult to find someone to debate us on this issue anymore, because it's crystal clear as to what we need to do. So one of the things you can do for those police officers and those law enforcement professionals that you can definitely direct them to our website, because right on our website we have a great video page. So you don't have to try to explain this issue to them. They can hear it directly from us. And the best video that I've seen thus far of our speakers, as relates to content and time, it's 14 minutes long, and it's by Peter Criss. He's one of the co-founders of the organization, Peter Criss. Criss spelled like Christ. And you can find his video on there. He's being interviewed by two reporters. And he hits everything. And if you watch that video and you're not thinking about these policies in some depth, you're just brain dead. That's the best thing I can say for you. So yeah, refer them to our website. You can have them contact us. Once they do that, they can contact us directly or through email. But have them watch one or two of those videos, and I think it'll get them thinking. I didn't make my 180-degree turn, in a matter of 2 days or 3 days. But when I started, like all of us, once you start, you never turn back. You may stall along this journey, but I know no one who's now involved in drug policy reform that has started down this road and decided, well, this is a bad place to go or be, and I'm going back to supporting prohibition. You always continue forward. Yes, and then I know you had a question, sir. And so, yes, sir.
I'm an emergency trauma doc trained right down the road at Truman 25 years ago. After a quarter century of practicing emergency trauma medicine in this state, I can tell you I've never seen a worse drug than K2 and bath salts. You think all drugs should be legal?
Yeah, I think all drugs should have some form of regulation and control. Now let's talk just briefly about this term legal, because when you say that, each and every one of you has a different perspective of what legal means. Some of you are probably thinking convenience stores or gumball machines or something like that. Some of you are probably thinking maybe like a pharmacy model or something like that.
I like the gumball.
So yeah, you have an alcohol. So you have to look at the drug first, and then determine. My way of figuring this out is how far do you need to go with policies of regulation and control for a particular drug, looking at each one on its own individual merits. How far do you need to go to extract it from the illegal marketplace? Okay, how far do you have to go to make it no longer profitable for criminals and gangs to make any money off it? And that's just how far you go. That's what I think. So there's so many different possibilities depending upon the drug.
And of course, like meth, K2's result of our prohibition. It wouldn't be there if it wasn't against law and order.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, sir, you had a question.
You mentioned earlier that the culture of the cop on the street you felt was pro-decriminalization or some sort of progressive. How does your organization, how are you viewed by the average cop on the street, and what can you do to change that culture that is fueled in part by the funding incentives?
For those cops on the street who have the knowledge foundation of this to understand that, I mean, as soon as they hear us, they get it, because they're out there every day and they see exactly what we're talking about, right? So they view us well. The challenge for them is that if they saddle up with us, then they're typically persecuted by the hierarchy of their police department. We have an active police officer in Victoria, Canada right now. He's one of our board members, David Gratzer. And he had to actually file a employment case against his chief, because his chief was trying to restrict his right to free speech during his own time. You know, he made it clear that he's not representing any police department. You know, he's speaking as a citizen of Victoria, British Columbia. And his chief has been putting sanctions on him. And so he had to file legally for an injunction and for relief. We've had police officers who were terminated, only later, you know, to be represented by, you know, like the ACLU and get their jobs back. So that's the challenge for those folks. Before, when I started speaking on this issue, I was a commander